Do you have roots in Atlanta?
My aunt, Dieta West, lives in Atlanta. She posted about it.
Oh, that's nice.
Supporting me.
So we're gonna wait just like a minute or so more to let people get in, and then we'll begin.
Love you too.
Your curls do look very nice, I meant to say before we got started.
Thank you.
Very lovely, yeah. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to This Week's In the Artist Studio. I'm Elena Gross, the Exhibitions Associate at MOAD. It's my pleasure today to be speaking and touring in virtual space with Oakland-based artist, Adia Millett. Before we get to the conversation, I just want to go through a few housekeeping things. First off, for all of our audience members, as was already mentioned, if you could please write in and tell us where you're joining from, that would be great. It's been really exciting to see so many familiar and new faces, or at least names, I suppose, in the chat box from all over the world these last few weeks. MOAD's physical building may be closed due to the mandatory shelter in place, but you can still get your fill of art and artists of the African diaspora. Each Wednesday at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, join MOAD staff members as we visit some of our favorite artists in their studio to see what they're currently working on and how their work is changing as a result of the quarantine. This is a rare opportunity to hear from artists directly from their studios. We'll follow all talks with an audience Q&A, so please feel free to leave your questions in either the chat box or the Q&A box anytime throughout the program, but we'll do it at the end. And please visit our website to see which artists we have coming up. You can also go back and watch all of our previous talks on the MOAD YouTube channel. That link may also be in the chat as well. This series is made possible by generous donations from the Westridge Foundation, our wonderful MOAD members, and viewers like you. So thank you all for your continued support. MOAD stands in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. We honor and mourn the senseless murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, and so many others who have lost their lives at the hands of police brutality and racial injustice, including those whose names we don't know. Most of us are settler, immigrants, or descendants of those forcefully brought to this continent. Our institutions were founded upon exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples whose land we are located. With deep respect, MOAD acknowledges that even in virtual space, our people, our work, and our network servers are on native lands, and we thank the indigenous people of the Bay Area who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. Lastly, if you've been enjoying this series or any MOAD programming, please consider donating to MOAD online. Donations of any amount are always welcome. The link to where you can donate will also be in the chat. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to today's featured artist. Adia Millett, originally from Los Angeles, received a BFA from the UC Berkeley and an MFA from Cal Arts. Millett's recent solo exhibitions include shows at the California African American Museum, the San Jose Quilt and Textile Museum, and Traywick Contemporary. She's been included in exhibitions at the Oakland Museum, the Museum of the African Diaspora, PS1, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Craft and Folk Art Museum in LA, the New Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Atlanta, the Contemporary Art Center New Orleans, and the Contemporary Art Center of Virginia. Millett has taught at Columbia College in Chicago, UC Santa Cruz, Cooper Union in New York, and California College of the Arts. Millett currently lives and works in Oakland, California. So welcome Adia. It's so nice to be able to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I love MOAD, one of my favorites.
Oh, excellent. We love to hear it. So just to kick us off, as this is a virtual studio visit, I like to ask people kind of to tell us a little bit about where you are right now, and if you're willing to show us a little bit of your studio space and kind of just talk about what that space looks like.
Yes, absolutely. I am in Oakland in my studio, which is also where I live. I just, right before COVID started, beginning of March, I moved out of the house that I was living at and the studio that was separate and put them together, which was perfect timing because I wouldn't have been
Yeah.
able to do that. So now I have it all in the same place. I can work late into the night and early in the morning, which works for me very well. And it's not super clean right now because I have a project that I just am in the kind of end phase of, which is a series or a puzzle that I did of
Oh,
meanings, and that is it's all the money from that is going to the Color of Change. So it's just a donation piece, but we had about 50 orders of the puzzle, and so you can see we got a lot of boxes going out.
oh, it's amazing. I mean, now is the time for puzzles.
Exactly. Everyone's at home wanting to do something. There's a few paintings behind me, recent work, a couple over there that I'm
Oh,
still working
wow.
on. You can kind of see the space.
It's beautiful.
A lot of, and then I have a whole wall of stuff that is sold that just hasn't been picked up yet. So got lots of stuff going on in the studio.
So you've been busy, is what it sounds like these last few weeks, months, I suppose. Now.
Yeah, it's been this COVID time has been a very productive and given me an opportunity to work on projects that I've been wanting to work on, but just haven't been able to sit still, and so it's been good for that.
Do you want to talk about any of the projects you've been working on?
Sure, I will talk about two of them. Besides the paintings, I am working on a project called the Milk Line, which is I'm interviewing and collecting fabric from female identified people, where I do an interview on Zoom and I ask them for a piece of fabric connected to their mothers. And then they tell the story around the fabric and share some wisdom, just kind of wanting to share the female wisdom in our voices. And so eventually I will take all the fabric and create a large textile piece and an exhibition around that. Really excited about that.
That sounds beautiful.
And the way it works is that after the female identified person donates their piece of fabric, they invite another person so that we create a chain, a link, or a line. So that's one of the fun projects that I'm working on that I can do from home. And then the other one is a project, an Instagram online auction that features one artist a week, called The Art of It All.
Yeah, I think I saw that on your Instagram.
Yeah, so I'm collaborating with a wonderful local curator, Charmin Bakey, and we each week feature an artist, and then people can bid right on Instagram, and then at least 20% of the proceeds will go to a charity of their choice. But for me, as I was starting to do this, thinking about how challenging it is for artists right now because you can't go to a gallery and see their work, and wanting to just provide a way to have some support and income for Bay Area artists in particular. So that's been really fun.
So before we move on to more of the questions, people want to know if and where they can order the puzzles. Are there any still available? How long will you be in the puzzle business, I should ask?
Yes, that's a great question. Well, I ordered a large number of them. They're pretty much all gone, and people are still requesting them. So I probably within the next few months will do another order, and I'll post that on Instagram. And you just gotta get on it because what I do is I post it, and then I give everyone like a week to place their order,
and they're gone.
The whole process to get them made and shipped. Yeah.
Wow.
But it'll happen again.
Yeah. So we've discussed a little bit this project that you have with the fabric and a little bit of the puzzles. So I think that kind of takes me into the first kind of question is if you wouldn't mind giving a little bit of a brief description or background on your work for folks who might not be familiar with you. I know that you work in a lot of different mediums, and we're going to be, talking about a variety of those today. So if you wouldn't mind just giving us a little primer.
Yeah. So yeah, I do work in a lot of mediums. I probably initially was most known for the miniatures that I have made, which are dollhouse size structures with things happening, electricity, but also work with textile, quilting, wall hanging pieces, work with cross stitch, embroidery, work with painting, collage, drawing. I'd done quite a few installations of rooms that you can go inside of. So the mediums range. There are several kind of themes that I'm attempting to address, a lot around domestic space, how structures and home can be a metaphor for human subjectivity and our identities, and thinking about how we can deconstruct those and invent new and expansive identities. These days, talking a lot about identity in relationship to landscape and larger outdoor space. Yeah, so the topics are kind of endless. They can go on, but that probably is the quickest, easiest way I can say it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I just want to make sure everyone has a little bit of a chance to kind of be introduced to your work before we start getting in depth. So I think one thing that I'm always interested in artists who work in multiple mediums is sort of how you began that process. Did you always kind of envision your practice as being multidisciplinary, or did one material kind of lead you to another one?
Yes, and yes. When I first started, I was doing the miniatures and a lot of needlepoint work. And so for me, I was really investigating craft and still continue to investigate craft and kind of how I could take it from being this kind of low art form to something that you see in institutions more, and kind of feeling like a lot of the tradition around craft is like this passive way to implement values, and thinking about how we can have conversations about topics like class and gender and race, all through this very like material kind of object. And for me, there was something really important about the hand, about something not being produced outside of the artist's hand. And so me really wanting the labor and the time and the meditation that kind of goes behind that. So that was initially the start. And then each kind of material has led to the next. So with the miniatures, at some point I was doing a lot of those and was like, I don't want to be restricted by this medium. I saw so many artists who they get their one thing and they just do it for, decades. And so really wanting to make sure that I didn't get myself pigeonholed as the miniature maker.
Yeah.
So was like, well, I'm still going to stay in the vein of craft. So started learning how to quilt, and that kind of took on a life of its own, and was thinking about it in terms of also thinking about domesticity. And then a lot of the things I couldn't technically do with quilting, I knew I could do if I did painting. So a lot of the paintings are almost like quilts I wish I could make.
Like 2D quilts?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I've never thought about that in terms of your work, but it makes so much sense. Even in the one that's just behind you.
Mm-hmm. The painting?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so these paintings, I would love to see these in a quilt form. And actually, I can show you. I have one quilt on the wall. This isn't too crazy walking around here, but you can kind of see you can make a connection to the paintings. See that one? Pretty big. Wow. Pretty big piece, but so, and then with the textile piece, a lot of that fabric, like with the miniatures, it's all found. A lot of it's found. So repurposed fabric, old clothes, sheets, random things that people give me, or that I find at secondhand stores. So just really loving the idea of taking the materials that we have in our environment and composing something out of them. Because to me, I feel like that's part of what creates our identities. Like our experiences are these different fabrics, or our culture, or our ancestors, and we put those fabrics together, and we get to develop into a piece of art. Develop into who we are.
Have you been experimenting with any new materials or new forms during shelter in place? Now that your home and your studio are now one, and obviously all of us are just spending so much more time in our spaces. Have you found yourself experimenting with different forms that you hadn't before?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I have been playing around with recently is oil pastels. That's kind of a new realm for me, and it allows me to get a little messier. As you can see, I'm a little bit of a neat freak.
I like some clean lines.
Yeah. And so with oil pastels, you got to get messy. So that's been fun, but I'm also like, I still need to practice before I'm ready to put those out in the world. Yeah, but besides that, I think just doing the Zoom, the videos and interviewing people and doing things that are a little bit more collaborative have been the time for me to do that. Ironically, considering that we're sheltering in place and not really seeing a lot of people, I've been doing more collaborative stuff.
So I kind of want to jump to the first work of yours that I had seen, which was I saw in person here at the Museum of the African Diaspora during the Black Refractions show, which was the Studio Museum in Harlem's kind of collection show that we did in 2018, I guess now, 2019. What is time? But you presented, and I kind of showed it briefly, and so I'll go back to that in just a second. But you showed a series of really beautiful miniature, were they cross stitch kind of works? And I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. Let me go ahead and put that back on the screen. 1 second.
Yeah, so you want me to just explain this piece a little?
Yeah, that'd be great.
So this piece is titled Inventing Truth. And I did this piece actually when I was at the Studio Museum in Harlem with Kehinde Wiley and Akira Harris back in 2000 and I don't know, maybe a long time ago in New York. And I basically started asking everyone I knew when they thought of their fathers or their grandfathers, their father figures, what objects did they think of? And so I was really thinking about fatherhood, masculinity, and thinking about my own fathers and my grandfathers, and specifically on my father's side, on the Black side. And these were a few of the objects that held like some depth and some complexity, and started to cross stitch them. And just the process of cross stitching is so time consuming. Like that $20 bill, you know, you start to like meditate on the topic, you know, meditate on what was my father's relationship to money. What was the story that goes behind the rifle? So each object has a story in that way for me on a personal level, but also felt more universal, more not universal, but very open for interpretation. And then at that point, I couldn't afford to buy frames, so I literally went to a hardware store and made these frames. It's so funny years later to see this piece and be like, wow, so like handcrafted.
Which feels so much like kind of the, you know, the works you would see on your grandma's wall, like at her home, you know, like it's so many people, that's how they frame things in this very intimate and domestic way, as opposed to what you are used to seeing in the gallery space. So I thought that was really, really touching as well.
Yes. Yeah, it's a really beautiful personal piece. And there's something too about trying to tell a story, but not spell the story out. Like that it doesn't have to be this linear narrative with a beginning and an end, but it can be these fragments that invite memories of our own to kind of come in.
Yeah. I think it was immediately apparent to me, I feel like, looking at all of these together, that this was a portrait without even seeing a person's face, without ever seeing a person's face, and thinking about what each of these objects kind of the life that they have in public life, and thinking about my own father and his relationship to Newport specifically, that kind of takes you back. And so it seems like there's a lot of memory that is also kind of a part of your practice. It's these objects existing as these totems almost of these other emotional or familial or resonant kind of moments. And I don't know if you can
well,
talk
I'll tell you
about memory.
I love that you say portrait, because specifically as a Black artist, I feel like the Black body is so relevant and is so present in the majority of Black art that I see. And that has always been a challenge for me, is how can we talk about our subjectivity and about the Black body without actually having the body there. And so to me, when people say, you know, how is the black figure in your work. To me, it's completely present, but our projection is different when it's based on these objects, because I think that so much of our identity is based on the material and the objects and the culture and the sound that we place upon it.
Yeah, I think that's music to my own ears. That's something that I think a lot of that I really appreciate about your work, and about a number of Black artists, especially in the kind of 20th and 21st, early 21st century as well, like are thinking about like how to tell these stories in new ways, even in new ways visually. So that kind of brings me to something that I'm interested in as well is sort of, for you as being a very highly contemporary living artist maker, seeing your work in this show, in this very, not comprehensive, but this very wide ranging show, like Black Refractions, next to Buford Delaney's and, Barkley, like, what was that like for you, kind of seeing yourself amongst these other, in this lineage, and sort of seeing your work as being a part of this, this family of artists? Well, maybe family is the wrong word, but this kind of, this history of artists.
Well, a couple of things. One, to me, it made me feel like the Studio Museum is family, and that they are able to see to see these younger generations, and it was an honor in that way. I mean, obviously, when I was in college, I was learning about some of the artists who were in that show, and so to be actually showing with them is really great. But I think that really began with freestyle, the groundbreaking show that Thelma Golden did in the early 2000s, that I myself and several other really amazing Black artists were in. And I remember, that was post graduate school for me. And all of a sudden I'm in New York in a museum full of other Black artists my age, which I had never seen. I wasn't used to that, And so for all of us, it was like, we had finally found home. We finally found a place where our voice was important. So that kind of feels like, for me, that was the beginning of realizing that that I could actually be an artist and potentially survive.
Oh.
And now we're at the point
real deep.
Surviving, but it's
to be able to see it. Yeah, that's so, I mean, obviously that's so important in how you can kind of imagine what your future will be in this.
I remember being at the opening and seeing Lorna Simpson and David Hammonds and Fred Wilson and being like, oh my God, it was like celebrities to me, and having them, support me, being like, I love what you're doing. Lorna Simpson saw some photos I had taken of the miniatures and was like, I got to give you my large format camera so you can do some really beautiful prints. And it started a whole thing for me.
So with that's an excellent pivot, because I want to take a look at some of the miniatures actually. And, you start to talk a little bit about your fascination and your interest in interior space and domesticity and kind of family life. And so I just wonder how your own personal history and family life, perhaps, like how does that show up in your work, and whether you begin these ideas. Let me just put some of them up on the screen first. But like, whether or not you begin some of these ideas from a place from like a real place, or from a place of pure imagination, or from memory even.
Yeah. So this is part of a series that I did a year after the tsunami in Thailand. And with a lot of the miniatures, you'll see it's not a complete room in a house. There's something missing. There's something skewed. So for me, when I think about the house that I went to, my grandmother's house, I'm missing half of the objects in it in my memory of it. I'm just remembering the couch. I'm just remembering that one outlet in the wall, And so this was an opportunity to allow the memories and the kind of fictional components that come into our memories, that they change. But then I'm usually using the objects in the space to as characters. So it's almost like they become the character on a stage. Oftentimes,
Mm-hmm.
my father was an actor, and so I'd see him on the stage with one or two props, and the props became the entities that he was communicating with, the chair he was sitting on. So that's partially why I wanted the spaces to be emptied out and to say, what are we left with when we take all the other stuff away and really hone in on that thing that takes us to another dimension. And wanting my viewers to not be able to just easily say, oh, this is this place, this location, but that it becomes more open-ended like we are.
Right.
You know? But I will say that I think that for me, what's really interesting when I see this work, because this is older, is that I really believe the psychology of artists changes over time. And so their work changes. It evolves based on their emotional state, based on the way they see the world. This earlier work for me had a lot to do with grief. Having lost my father when I was 17. And then it had a lot to do with kind of the repair and solitude and being alone and the shadows of life. So a lot of these photographs have these really beautiful, deep shadows in them because I did like 14-minute exposures in the dark. So I acknowledge that. And then as time has gone on and I've changed and grown, the work has become more playful and more light and bright and colorful and more invested in conversations of community. So I think that's like, especially for young artists who are listening, like your work is going to change, and it's okay for it to be a reflection of where you're at, and you know, there's something beautiful about that process to look back at it. Yeah.
Yeah. That's so I think one of the things that I really love about the miniatures also, and you just kind of said a little bit, is that toying, that juxtaposition between playfulness and like melancholy almost. And it feels like that is that's something that was present in the cross stitch work. In a sense, I feel like that's also, I just keep coming back to memory, I suppose. That's also, I feel like, something that's present a little bit in the quilts. There's this vibrancy to the colors you're using and sort of the energy of all of the different lines and different angles. But they are also ultimately these objects that have these lives that we live our lives in, and that have lives outside of kind of the gallery wall. And so that's another thing I kind of want to think about too and ask you about, is sort of how do you envision, like how much say have you had in terms of how your work is displayed, and I guess like what the space kind of looks like when you're presenting, especially like the miniatures, or the, not just the photographs, but there's also, I believe there's one that's kind of a little standalone house that you can kind of peer into. How do you think about kind of the orientation of these objects in space?
Yeah, I mean, I think initially with the miniatures, I liked to show them in a separate room from the photographs, because people would come in and look at the photographs and be like, oh, is this a life-size space? And then they walk into another room and they realize that it's smaller, it's this tiny little miniature, right? So there's one of these up at CAM right now that they just added to their permanent collection. And yeah, it's like this separate little thing that you peer into. You have, because it's so small, there's this way that it becomes almost like this precious thing we want to touch. Everybody always wants to put their fingers and touch these little guys, because there's something playful, but they're also really sullen and kind of, some of them are dark. I think for me, contradiction is like the essence of life and truth. So for me, in terms of even on a personal level, allowing there to be this beautiful balance between masculine and feminine, between the kind of aspects of ethnicity,
light and dark,
all of it, wanting that
small, yeah,
exist in everything. And same with the work, it can be dark and it can be abstract, but maybe you can find something in there if you look hard enough, like wanting there to be that balance. To me, that exists in nature, all the time. You walk into nature and half of the things there are dead and half of the things are blooming and alive. There's patterns, but those patterns are constantly being broken apart. So to me, that's like the greatest teacher is being able to not think that we can look at something and have it figured out.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was a good, that was a great little, that was a great nugget. So I want to talk a little bit about the patterns in your work as well, and sort of how your work favors geometric, as we can see in kind of the works behind you, and I'll show a few examples as well, but how much of your work favors kind of geometric patterning, but at the same time, the shapes and the angles aren't as rigid as I think some of the, if you've kind of studied art history, some of the art historical precedents that you're used to seeing, it's not as formalized, I suppose. And so there's a lot of like fracturing and breaking. Breaking Patterns is the name of one of the exhibitions. So I was just wondering if you could talk about this idea of breaking and disrupting pattern making, and what that kind of affords you in the work that you're doing. You kind of touched on it already, but if you wanted to talk about a bit more about it.
I mean, I feel like breaking patterns in general is like my jam.
Yeah.
In every aspect of life. And with the textile pieces, it was just a great opportunity to do that, to start to use the traditional pattern making of a lot of quilts, where there's you make a pattern, you put it down, and the whole thing is really well put together. And then literally cutting it apart. So I would make a traditional square rectangle quilt and then cut it apart and turn it into something else. Really loving the idea of breaking the rules that are set up within quilting. And then with the painting, I almost was thinking about structures, and like this is a great example of like almost these building blocks for structures. And then what happens when they start to come apart and flatten out, and perspective is constantly being skewed. Something looks like it's coming out, but then maybe it's going in. And then also wanting there to be this exchange between things being really clean. And then there's some lines that are a little curved, a little off, like allowing those mistakes to be welcome.
Yeah, this one's great because it, obviously because of the square kind of cropping of it, but then there's this like nice kind of spherical thing that's happening, and those two things, to your point about contradiction, at first seem at odds, but become this very, it just draws you into the center. It just kind of draws you into it more and more, and you lose yourself, but you also find yourself a little bit in these very interesting places, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing about the painting is that I get to go, it's the process, is getting to go back and forth between having a plan and then letting that plan be disrupted. Like this guy behind me was totally different 3 weeks ago. And and my assistant would hear me say, I hate it. I hate the piece. And usually when I would say, I hate this, that means eventually I'm going to really like it, because I lose the fear of messing it up. I'm just going to paint just throw a bunch of black paint over this because I don't like it. And it's almost like the discomfort of a relationship with the piece that you're working on is what gives you the freedom to change it. And I think about that process in relationships with community and with people and with my own identity. If something's not working, I get to go in there and alter it and change it and build a different relationship.
And that's a really profound way of looking at the time we're in now, in terms of all of these systems and all of these different ways that, public life we've taken for granted in certain ways, and how all of those systems and structures are breaking down, and what the possibility comes from that. I think something that I see a lot in your work, and that I think, is really important for this time we're living in, is this idea of breaking apart as a means of creating something new, or as a means of adding. And I think you see it a lot in your work too, in like certain works where there is painting combined with these layers of, say, I'm just going to go ahead and show one of them. Let's see. Like one of these kinds of works where there is this breaking apart of these different spaces between the shingles, but then there's also an adding. There's an adding on top of, and there's adding in between. And so just seeing breaking as ultimately a generative process, and seeing deconstruction as being the making of something new, as opposed to the complete destruction of something.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, I think that transition and impermanence is probably, for me, one of the greatest gifts of life, is being able to accept it and use it as an opportunity to grow. So here, this is me kind of in conversation between the miniatures, the actual structures, and the structures flattening out, and me thinking about them as facades, like thinking about this idea of this is who I am, Adia, and then what happens when I take that apart? What's underneath? What else can kind of, so then you can see the painting, you can see the wallpaper on the bottom half of it, the miniatures literally turning into something else. And so I think if you were to look at the my work in according to the oldest to newest, you would see, oh, like you could see the transitions when Adia was thinking about doing this next thing, and in the process, she still was kind of like, okay, we're changing our relationship. I'm not making the miniatures anymore, but I'm going to make a facade, and then I'm going to add the paint, and now I'm going to do the paint without the. So there's this beautiful kind of. Yeah. I think probably you could look at the majority, if not all, of my work and say, oh, I see how this is a transition, how something's coming apart in the process of turning into something else.
I love the variety of materials you'll use in one work. Like, I mean, taking this one as an example of like wood and paint and glitter and kind of building, and also smear. And I wonder, just in terms of process, how long something like this takes you, like even in those transitions, how long it kind of takes you to make one of these, and how long, like, I guess just how those transitions happen kind of in real time.
That's a good question.
Like, do you know, like with, like in a way, like with this work, would you have say this began as, clearly it began as a miniature to a certain extent, but where did you see like the need to start to cut in, and like how did that like kind of take place?
Yeah. I mean, I think it was probably, I was working on this while I started painting by itself, and I was still kind of attached to doing the facade shingle pieces. And so I was like, well, can I combine the two? And then I kept thinking, well, then the house has got to come apart. Like that kind of came in. Also, for me, I think the coming apart in terms of the house has to do with the fact that when I left for college, the house that I had grown up in, one of the houses I grew up in, was set on fire. Over 100 homes were burnt down, and so we lost everything. And so I think that there's something about, and the house had a shingle roof. So the house next door, the fire department could save, but because it had a wood shingle roof, they were like, we're not even gonna try to save that. So there is a layer in here about how that impermanence and that loss developed my own relationship to art making and to just understanding life, And so to me, finding a way to show that and show the kind of coming apart and the depth of that, but also to show the beauty in that.
So apparently someone wants to know whether or not you played with doll houses as a child, if that was part of your childhood.
I remember seeing them, but I did not actually have a dollhouse.
It's just an adult fascination. Yeah.
Well, you know what the funny thing is that I think for me, the dollhouses, there's two references. My stepfather studied architecture. We would drive up and down the streets just looking at homes. And so I had a fascination with home and structure. And then my birth father was on stage. He was an actor.
So sets.
These are like sets. They're like stages. So I think that there's something about that kind of informed my vision and where I find beauty and where I find a palette or like a canvas to understand space.
Yeah. I'll say one of my like last-ish questions, because then I want to turn it over to Q&A, is so in sort of looking at all of these different materials and all of these different forms your work has taken, one thing that I'm always kind of interested in is how artists take certain like craft traditions and fine art traditions and showcase them both in your work. And I think you can see kind of the craft influence in the materiality of the work that you're using, but you can also see these iconographic and art historical references in the work that you're using. Do you see that distinction as being useful at all? Or is that something you're intentionally playing with? Or do you think that, or something you're intentionally blurring perhaps in the work that you're doing?
You mean kind of the play between craft and
Mhm.
fine? Mm,
Do you see it as useful even as a I mean, I know where I am leaning towards in sort of the way I think about the two and like the collapsing of the division between them as forms. But I was wondering, I was just curious as to um how that shows up, I guess, in how you see your work or how your work is perceived even, especially as a, a woman in this field, as a Black woman in this field, like how that distinction maybe plays out.
yeah, I mean, I think there's two things. One, I think that the materials we use and how we use them are parallel to how we understand ourselves. And so if I can figure out a way to integrate dark and light, you know, fine art and something that we consider not fine art, and figure out ways to redefine what that is, I will do whatever I can for that. But I think the other part with craft for me is the handmade. You know, so many
Mhm.
artists rely on other people to make their stuff, and for me, the process of making something is very somatic. It's very body oriented, and as artists, we spend a lot of time up in our heads, and so finding a way to keep that relationship between me being, you know, in labor and kind of in that movement and the physicality and the repetition is like it's great. And when I go to see shows, other people's work, the stuff where I see the hand in there is
Oh
just
yeah, that's my favorite part too. I love a good fingerprint. Like a greasy fingerprint on something is my absolute favorite.
yes, me too.
Yeah. And I think you definitely you get a lot of that, like having seen I saw your work as well at Traywick Contemporary a little bit ago, not that many months ago. But one of the things I really loved about, like a piece almost like this one, when you get up close, you can see that these like tiles have not been, they're not fabricated in a lab somewhere and then kind of glued together. You can see like the little like fibers at the bottom of each one. Some of them are different sizes. They're a bit uneven. You can see the brush strokes. You can see kind of the glue in certain spaces. And I think it makes it so much more special in that way. And it becomes this, you feel like you're in conversation with the artist who made it in a very different way,
Mm.
which is, it sounds like, perhaps conversation between you and your audience is something that you're interested in. I don't know.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, it seems, yeah.
I mean, I think with the miniatures, the fact that I'm asking you to step down and look inside with the textile, there's something for me about wanting you to engage or to touch, or with the installation that was at CAM, you could go sit inside of this 2-wall mural and, sit there and hear. There was a sound piece that came down and you could kind of be in the environment. So yes, my viewers are definitely important.
So let's see what we've got in the Q&A section. Okay, so the first question is from, well, I don't know if people want me to read their names, but I will anyway. The first question comes from Nicole Howard and says, based upon your own positionality, what has been the most memorable response to your work?
There's two that I think pop into mind. When I was doing a residency at the Studio Museum, I had built this installation, and I collected all this stuff that I found in Harlem in the trash. So an old bed, a lampshade, all the stuff. Put this crazy wallpaper up, and these two old Black women came in and were looking at the piece, talking about it, and they were like, "Are you the artist?" I was like, "Yes." And they said, Whose room is this? And I said, "Well, who do you think it is?" And they started to tell me the stories of who they thought occupied the space. And they were different. Both of them were really different. And it brought me so much joy that they were even spending the time to imagine who occupied this installation, and that they weren't the same, that they had different stories based on their own experiences. So that was touched my heart. And then the second one is I had a show at Pro Arts in Oakland, and a group of kindergartners came in, and I took them around the show. And the textile piece that I showed you earlier was in that show. And I said, "What do you guys think this piece is about?" And this one little kindergartner started telling me about my piece and how it looked like it was an aerial map from above and all this stuff. And I was just like, that
aerial
is
maps.
brilliant.
Kindergarten. What are they teaching these kids? I mean, that's fantastic. That's
I was like, I need to add that to what this piece is about, you know? And it's moments like that where the work is doing what I wanted to do. It's creating spaces for people to bring their own stories and have their own relationships. It's not based on what they read on the wall.
Yeah. Oh. So I don't, the next I want to be sure that I'm getting the questions as well from Facebook Live, in addition to the ones we have on Zoom. So the next question is a Zoom question, but then I'll probably jump to one of the incoming. So the next question is from D West. It says, I'm interested in knowing what the pack of Newport cigarettes represented. I'm asking for a particular reason.
Well, that's interesting because I don't know if her father, my grandfather, smoked cigarettes at all.
Mm-hmm.
But my stepfather smoked cigarettes, and my stepfather smoked cigarettes. And when I lived in Harlem, everybody and their mother smoked Newports. It's like Newports on the ground everywhere. And so I developed a relationship to them just because it was a part of my environment. And I think that, you know, I have a very complicated relationship with tobacco, being raised with people who smoked. And there's just so much weight in that and so many stories. So that's where that came from.
Yeah. I think tobacco also obviously has this kind of larger historical importance too, in a way. That's not something I was thinking when I originally saw it, but now just in seeing that question framed and like hearing your answer is something, yeah, it just makes me wonder. And brand loyalty, I feel like, is so specific in certain ways. Like my father only smoked Newports, and that's like a very specific thing. Yeah, so that's fascinating.
And they take on cultural implications, you know?
Mm-hmm. A very serious significance, yeah. So this one I think is coming from Facebook, and it says, she mentioned you mentioned your childhood home burning down as an impetus for making the houses. Being in the Bay, do you think about the housing crisis as part of your work?
Absolutely, yes. And I'm not sure how much I can say about it, but I am scheduled to do a commission at the headquarters of Facebook headquarters in Menlo Park. And the piece that I'm doing down there, it's a 23-foot long mural, and it is in response to the homeless tent encampments in Oakland. There are several not far from me, and they're constantly changing and being taken away. It's a topic that I'm very concerned with, and so yes, I'm constantly thinking about what home means. A lot of the paintings that I've done in the past year are around shelter and tent housing. I have several pieces. They're kind of me just investigating my personal relationship to that.
Do you often do public works at all in terms of?
You know, it's interesting because only in this past year, after I did the piece at CAM, the 2-wall mural piece, I knew that I wanted to start doing more stuff like that, and have been asked recently to do those, but because of COVID, it's kind of on the process. Just the end of last year, did my first proposal for a piece through the San Francisco Art Commission down in Bayview, was one of 3 finalists, and didn't get it, but it was such an amazing learning experience. I can definitely continue to do that. And then the thing at the commission that Facebook just came up. So it's kind of another realm that I want to continue to develop.
To kind of, you know, like to piggyback, I guess, off of that previous question, I was also wondering this too when you started to talk about the miniatures and the roof specifically, and thinking about fire and how, especially in the Bay, how prevalent and how precarious shelter can be in the face of, you know, these natural disasters, and thinking about these very, you know, you were saying some in talking about different contradictions, even in terms of like you go into nature and you see both death and rebirth, and sort of, which also, you know, like that is ultimately what fire kind of does. It breaks apart to regrow. I was wondering if that's something, if if the kind of California, thinking about fire basically comes into play in your work in different ways as well, and just kind of thinking about that that precarity, I suppose, or even just environmental cause, like, you know, sort of climate crisis. Even.
We had this, the curator and I had this whole conversation around natural disasters and the elements. So for me, all the elements, water, earth, wind, fire, they all have this really direct connection to transition, to impermanence. You know, hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, all of them have, the earth is like saying things are going to change. I mean, I guess COVID is an example of that as well.
And viruses apparently as well.
Exactly. So to me, yes, and there. I mean, I think it's more symbolic of this idea that there's something that we're afraid of that forces a change, and also is the impetus for new life and new growth. And yeah, so definitely, fire comes. There's been several pieces where fire has made its way in, and water,
yeah,
and earth, all of it.
Yeah. So we have the person who asked for a very specific reason has explained. They said, "Thanks, I don't smoke now, but it is ironic that when I started smoking, I was in New York visiting your father when I was 18 years old. He didn't introduce me to cigarette smoking. I just felt like smoking because everyone else was, and Newport was the brand that I bought while hanging out in New York." Lol.
Nice.
So that's a nice little anecdote.
It is. Thank you.
Okay, so the next question is anonymous, but it is talking about objects, art, or craft. Some folks say that things in museums are cool as objects that have survived. How does this resonate for you in terms of your own objects or others you seek out? And what do you seek out in museums?
That's a great question. I'm more interested in craft, actually. To be honest, when I go to museums, especially quilting, I'm like, you know, like G's been. That's like, you know, I love that work. That's my inspiration. It, to me, it is an example of how Black folks have been innovators of everything, you know, and our resilience and our ability to overcome struggle is this beautiful gift that allows us to access our creativity in a way that is phenomenal. So that's often what I'm drawn to when I go to see shows, is like, how do we see something that was developed before its time, that was already creating something that, you know, modernists would be attempting to do years later. Kind of that gets me. But I also like it because I've lost a home, and because of, you know, just loss. I think my relationship to objects is pretty. I love the idea of letting things go, you know, and I don't expect that any of the things that I'm making are going to last well beyond my lifetime. I'm kind of not attached to that. They're things, they're beautiful. And for me, if they can be a reminder, like the art that I put in my house of other artists who I love, it's a reminder of something that's important to me, you know, and it will be here until it's not.
It's not, yeah. So this is a comment from Francis B. Stanfield. I visited G's Bend and your work reminded me of that experience. I'll never forget it. You are awesome.
Oh, thank you.
So one final question that I have for you, I suppose, that I wanted to end on, just in kind of thinking about just the reality of where we all are right now, and sort of how tough the last few weeks have been in the face of so many different kind of global social cultural upheavals, is what or who is bringing you inspiration or joy right now in your art making? Where are you finding the most, I guess, the most thrilling or creative moments, or, you know, what is driving you to make these days?
Am I going to say this? Yeah, I am going to say it. To be honest with you, because of COVID and because I can't just go over to all my friends' houses and give them big hugs, a lot of my joy is coming from taking hikes and being outside and submerging myself, camping, being outside in nature. That's my God. the earth and what it provides for us. I've been harvesting from my hikes mugwort and bay and yarrow and all these things that have been used for healing for centuries, beyond that. And that's where I find inspiration, seeing the patterns, thinking about how those organic shapes can play into these kind of more fractal, digital shapes, and just really building a new language for the work to come. So outdoors, this earth, this planet that we get a brief time with, is my inspiration, big time.
Well, thank you for coming back from the woods to be on this video chat with me and all of our viewers right now. We, deeply appreciate it. Being online all the time can be a real struggle. So it's really great that you're getting these moments out to be outside and to feel your body and to be kind of, as you say, on this planet that we all only have a short amount of time with.
If I could give one piece of advice to anybody, it would be go outside in nature and take your shoes off and let your feet just be on the earth. Do it. Try it.
Do it this weekend.
That's where we came from.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Adia, for talking with me today, and thank you to everyone who watched the webinar today. And if you want to watch it again, or you just want to share with your friends, please visit the MOAD YouTube channel. Keep following us on social media and following all of our updates to see who's coming next. It was so great being able to talk with you.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for coming and listening. Really appreciate it.
And we've got like 2 minutes left. So if anybody has any last thing to say before I kick everyone out, please do so.
I just want to say I love you to all my family. I see you guys showed up. It's so wonderful. So good.
Thank you all.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.